Welcome, everybody. We'll get started shortly. I'm seeing that our attendees are slowly getting on, slowly trickling on. So we'll just give them maybe another couple of seconds before we begin. Great. Well, with that, maybe we can go to the next slide. And I'd like to share some quick meeting reminders before we jump in. First, ASL and closed captioning is available for today's session. Our ASL interpreters will be spotlit throughout the presentation, but you may need to enable subtitles by selecting either the CC or transcript icon on your toolbar. The webinar is being recorded, and we will be sharing the materials and recording via email next week. You can also check out the ccltss.org materials page for an archive of all of our past meeting recordings and materials. And lastly, we really kind of designed this session to be interactive, and we've enabled chat to allow attendees to engage throughout the presentation. So we're also setting aside time at the end, and we'll open the floor to hear from all of you. So please feel free to vent, highlight wins, share your perspectives on next steps for the stakeholder community. And if you utilize chat, and I hope you will, please remember that this is a collaborative environment. And so we urge you to remain courteous and respectful of others. And maybe we can kick off, excuse me, by asking each of you to drop your name and organization in the chat. And let's keep it fun. Since this is the time of the year that we're all thinking about vacations, why don't you go ahead and add your dream travel destination? And who knows, maybe you'll inspire others to adventure a bit this summer. And thank you, Nancy, for advancing to the agenda. So as you already know, we're diving into the May revise today. And we've invited a great group of folks to share their perspectives on how the state budget is shaping up for older and disabled adults. We're going to kick off with a sort of general overview of the state budget process and then turn it to our panelists to help us get the conversation started. And again, the session was built out to be less formal and more interactive, so I encourage all of you to use the chat and the Q&A, and of course, feel free to raise your hand to add to the conversation. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Yasmin, Senior Policy Advocate at Justice and Aging, who will briefly walk us through the state budget process and share some highlights from the May revise. So, Yasmin.
Thanks so much, Maria.
Yasmin, would you mind turning on your camera?
It is on. There we go.
There it is.
There we go.
Thanks.
Thanks, Maria, and it's nice to be with everyone today. Good afternoon. So my name, again, is Yasmin Peled, and I'm the Senior Policy Advocate with Justice and Aging, and I'm based here in Sacramento. So I think we can move the slides forward. And I'll just be giving a quick budget overview, and I thought that it might be good to just quickly review the timeline that we're in. So the budget cycle begins on January 10th, when the governor has to release a proposed state budget. And so that happens on January 10th. And then between February and April, there are legislative budget hearings where there are lots of hearings to review what the governor has proposed. There's lots of time for public comment and for folks to sort of dive deeper into all of the proposals that are made in that initial budget. Then on May 14th, the governor releases a budget revision, which is what just happened a few weeks ago. And the main reason that there is a budget revision in May is because that is after the state tax returns come in. So there's a better fiscal estimate of what the state budget is actually going to be allocating resources for. So that's why there is that May revision. And so, you know, in bad budget years, when there's an economic downturn, usually you'll see cuts in a May revision. We're in a good fiscal year this time around, so there's not any cuts, but we'll get into some of the details in a minute here. Then in May and June is the final budget negotiations, where the Assembly and the Senate are reviewing the May revision, trying to add in what they think is missing. It's those final negotiations. There are some hearings, but there's also a lot of negotiations done behind the scenes. And then the constitutional deadline is that the legislature needs to vote on a budget architecture by June 15th. And if the legislature does not vote on a budget architecture by June 15th, then they stop getting paid. And so they're very much incentivized to get a budget passed by June 15th. And then the new fiscal year begins on July 1st. And you might hear things about, oh, well, trailer bill happens later, or, not everything gets finished in that initial budget. And that's true. And the overall budget architecture needs to be done on June 15th. But then there can be additional budget bills and things getting worked out beyond that deadline. But the overall architecture, the deadline is June 15th. So we can talk a little bit about what was initially proposed in January. So that's when there are initial revenue projections, and then a little bit of the aging priorities that were included in the January budget. There's continued implementation of the master plan for aging data dashboard. There was a proposal to reduce premiums or eliminate the premiums in the Medi-Cal Working Disabled program, more investments in volunteer and community engagement programs, more investment in the Returning Home Well program. The governor proposed to expand CalFresh eligibility for those over the age of 55, regardless of their immigration status, and then continued investment in the Healthy Brain Initiative. As you can see here, there's not a whole lot on aging and disability priorities, and there was advocacy done at this point in January to send letters to the governor, to the legislature, saying, hey, there's not a whole lot here for aging priorities. We'd like to see more investment. And so then when the May budget revision came out just a few weeks ago, we have the updated revenues. So there's a total surplus of about $97.5 billion. However, about half of that gets allocated to other spending. So it goes to the rainy day fund, goes to schools and education. And so only about half of that can be used for discretionary spending. So we have, when we talk about the budget surplus and how much we have all this money this year, we've got about 49 billion in discretionary spending. The hope was that because we have this surplus, that there would be major investments made in aging and disability priorities, given that the governor has the master plan for aging and has committed to this. However, as you can see here, not a whole lot of additional investments for aging priorities. Some more money for implementation of the master plan, money into the community living fund, a small amount of money for HCBS infrastructure planning and development. And then there were other small investments across departments that you could make the case that that has an aging angle or that has a disability angle. But at the end of the day, there's very little investment in programs for older adults and people with disabilities. And so I think part of what we'll talk about here is where we see room for advocacy, where we see need for additional investment, and happy to answer questions for what people want. But I will say that it's been disappointing that there is all of this money, and yes, it's discretionary spending, it's one-time money, it's hard to do ongoing programs. But we have this money and we're not investing it in these communities. So I think just one more slide. So what's happening next here? The final negotiations are happening. So the Assembly and Senate have to come up with their plan, and then they have to present that to the governor and do the final negotiation with the governor. And then they'll vote on that budget architecture, and then the budget bill has to be signed by July 1st in order for the new fiscal year to get started. And then I'll just do a quick plug for some of what Justice and Aging's top priorities this year. that we're looking for, especially in the budget, is to reform the Medi-Cal share of cost program, to improve affordability in the Medi-Cal program, to create a rental stabilization program for older adults and people with disabilities, and then to fully restore the SSI SSP grants, which are slated, the full restoration is slated to happen by January 1st of 2024, and we're hoping that that timeline can be moved up to 2023, given the funds that we have this year. So I think we're headed onto a panel discussion, but this is my contact information. Happy to answer questions now or via email, and I know we're going to the panel and we'll have some back and forth, but I hope that that was a good overview of some of the initial investments, and the hope is that when the final budget comes out that we will be able to have extracted some more investments, but there's a lot of work to be done. So I think that's what we're going to talk about in this panel.
And I did see that I was muted. Thanks. We do have some questions, so I don't know if you're happy to jump back on and answer those, but I see one from Randy asking if you could talk a little bit about the GAN limit and how that's impacted the May revise or not.
Yeah, so a little bit of background on the GAN limit. The GAN limit is part of the state constitution. It was passed as a ballot initiative quite a few years ago, which basically says that if the state has a certain amount of extra tax revenue over a limit, that's the state has to give the money back to the taxpayers. And this is always a dance, especially in good budget years. Are we hitting that limit? Do we have to give the money back to taxpayers? And so there's lots of people much smarter than me, actuaries, people that do the numbers, try to figure that out. In the proposal that the governor did a few weeks ago, we are not hitting the GAN limit, and that is because that they're putting a lot, they're putting half the money into these reserves, right? Into state education, into the rainy day fund, they're paying down debts. And then the surplus that's discretionary, a lot of it is one-time funding. They're allocating a lot of it to emergency resources. They're allocating a lot of it to transportation, things that are exceptions to the GAN limit. So that's why we're not directly being impacted by the GAN limit this year, but part of the reason that we're not being impacted by the GAN limit is because we're not investing in programs like aging and disability and other sort of discretionary programs and diverting that money to programs that get around the GAN limit. So it's a very delicate balance, and last year there were a lot of conversations around it. There've been a lot of conversations this year. They're already starting to hedge, next year we're going to have trouble with investments because we're going to run into GAN limit issues. So personally, there always seems to be a way around it. They figured a way around it this far, and I think that there's broader conversations about GAN limit reform, but at this point, we're not up against the GAN limit. But if they really change the budget architecture, that might be an issue. But right now, I think we're in the clear for this year.
That's perfect. Thank you so much for that background. And then a question from Nina. No conference committee this year, is that correct?
Correct. In some years, the Assembly and Senate they don't come to an agreement behind the scenes. And so there's a conference committee where the Assembly puts their priorities together, the Senate puts their priorities together, and they have these hearings where they try to come to an agreement. And in a way that's nice because it's a public process. There's a way to engage public comment. But in the last few years, there's been no conference committee. The Assembly and Senate have worked behind the scenes to come to an agreement and bring their joint budget to the governor. So my understanding is that that's what is going to happen this year. Every year, the budget process becomes more and more opaque. So if me describing all this to you sounds confusing and all happening behind closed doors, that's because that's what happens these days.
Well, thank you so much. Okay, and let's turn to our panelists. And Yasmin, I don't know if you want to just stay on and kind of serve as a reactor on the panel. Maybe you have some additional thoughts that you want to add as we start the conversation, but I'd really love to welcome Sawait, who is the Senior Legislative Advocate at Disability Rights California, and Debbie, the Executive Director at Choice and Aging, and of course, Dwayne, the Legislative Director at CARA. And I think maybe we just stop screen share and we do like the Hollywood squares setup here, so we can all see each other. And thanks. And Nancy, if you could spotlight, that'd be fantastic. I'll help with it too. There we go. Thanks, everybody. Okay, so I actually, I want to kind of start off with Sawait to see, Sawait, if you can help us take a little bit of a deeper dive into investments specific or supportive of the disabled adult community. Are there any highlights you want to share? And sort of to follow up on that, are there any missed opportunities that DRC is talking about or tracking?
Yeah, absolutely, Mariah. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's really good to see you all as we're in budget land. I do want to sort of echo Yasmin's sentiments earlier that we are, while there were, we believe, significant investments made in the master plan of for aging in the January budget and the governor's May revision, DRC does see missed opportunities to make some significant investments in our long-term service and supports programs and initiatives. I think it's really because, when you think about the surplus, as Yasmin stated, we have $49 billion in discretionary funding. This is huge, right? And I think, what we would say is if not now, then when, right? We have longstanding inequities in our system. And if not now, then when, right? There are opportunities, I think, that still remain. We continue to urge the legislature to take advantage of this opportunity, really. We do see that there's an opportunity to make reforms of the Medi-Cal Share of Costs program. There are efforts underway to do just that in Assembly Bill 1900 that's moving. And we're also looking to accomplish this through the budget. So that's one opportunity that the legislature could really, we could really use the leadership of the legislature on. Also, we see an opportunity for creation of a new rental subsidy program, specifically targeting older adults and people with disabilities. We're also urging the legislature to push for full restoration of the SSI, SSP grants beginning January 1st, 2023. In addition, we're asking that the legislature would push for funding for adult day services to combat senior isolation, which has been a huge issue as we're sort of, getting out of this pandemic. And then, finally, fully funding the California Caregiver Resource Center in order to better serve family caregivers in the community. So these are just a few, investment opportunities that we can still push for. And we have, we, as part of the Master Plan on Aging stakeholder community, we were sort of shocked that the governor's budget did not include any of our recommendations. And so we're really calling on our legislative leaders to push for significant investments so that we can finally make the necessary investments that we need to make and to impact and improve the delivery of care for our the older adults and persons with disabilities, Mariah.
That's perfect. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And I know that the collaborative is keeping an eye on those items that you noted. We have sort of an internal process by which we vote and have consensus over budgetary and legislative items. And so we're going to be making that push as well in these next 2 weeks. And Debbie, I want to turn to you. You did promise that you would stay unfiltered, and I really appreciate your willingness to share sort of that raw perspective. So is there anything you want to add, and how are you feeling about the May revise?
Well, first of all, Maria, thank you for allowing me to come to the space unfiltered, because I had to ask permission. Most places I ask for forgiveness, but when it comes to Maria, I ask for permission. So I do want to say at the beginning of this, recognize that we're all in this place and space right now where our nation is a bit broken. Yasmin's comment about a lot of people much smarter than she is baloney, because we wouldn't have the state of affairs that we have in our nation if that was true. And I just want to hold space for the people who lost their children and friends who lost people in this last massive shooting, and that we can regulate women's bodies but not guns is something really, really shocking. We can't get baby formula. Like, there's so much brokenness, and I think that in California, we think that we're so far above that. And then we look at what happened with this budget. And I heard Sawait saying that, there was some shock with this budget. And my reaction, sadly, is not shock. I've come to expect this. In this month, I hit my 20-year mark working for Choice and Aging, working with, working in, working for, working all the things, all the prepositions. And it doesn't shock me, sadly. The comment, if not now, when, is already answered. If not now, never. There is no when. If you can't do it when you have $49 billion in discretionary funding, you're not going to do it. I mean, that is the statement in and of itself. And we all know and believe that a budget is a statement of values. And the values have been clearly articulated here. So we can put lots of things to paper, like wonderful plans and blueprints, but if we don't fund them, they are shelf ornaments. And our work on this, those of us who worked on this, Sawait mentioned, the Stakeholder Advisory Committee who worked on this master plan for aging. We probably put in 20 to 30 extra hours a week of our lives for 2 years because we were so thrilled at this opportunity. We had never, ever, ever had a governor ask for that. And now we're looking at when the rubber hits the road, there's no rubber, and I'm mad, I'm pissed, I'm angry, I'm furious, you can come up with all the words. And Yasmin said, we have work to do. We do, but it's not like we haven't been doing this work. So the question is, why is our work falling on deaf ears when the rhetoric is that there is a will to create a state where everyone can afford community living? So I think I want to just clarify, the last of the 5 bold goals of the master plan for aging talks about affording aging. And I think we need to rescript that language to affording community living, because I think that bold goal in and of itself takes disability out of the equation. So I think, for me, I want to just frame us in that. How do we afford community living? How do we afford the ability to self-direct and live on our terms in our space? And certainly this budget makes no effort at that. I want to thank Disability Rights for highlighting the need for the adult day services investment and the caregiver investment. Without these things, we have institutionalized our people who have disabilities and our elders. And I'm outraged, I'm outraged the same way that I was outraged when in 2020, in the first year of the pandemic, the May revise, we saw the wholesale elimination of adult day healthcare and the multi-purpose senior services program. The only other program in our section of the budget that was completely eliminated was what they called a duplicative service that was offered to people coming out of prison, something they said already existed. So we were clumped in that pile, and those were the only wholesale elimination of programs. So I think after this exercise, these number of years, it's clear to me that we need leadership that puts their money where their mouth is. And we're not seeing it right now. And can we call on our legislature? I'm really curious. I want to hear from Yasmin. I want to hear what her thoughts are on how we get there. I want to hear from AARP. They're the big elephant, man. They're like the huge one in the room, right? And we know that older adults vote. So how do we, I want to know the strategy, because it's a statement has already been made. What is our response? So I don't know how you respond to that.
That's great, Debbie. I mean, you know, the conversation, your thoughts and your perspective really kind of, to me, I've been thinking a lot about ageism and ableism and how that plays into what's funded and not funded and how policy rolls out. And I think that, at least in part, that some of the challenges that the stakeholder community is experiencing is just that. It's just this lack of prioritization for our population that is ingrained in the way that, you know, the way that people think about older adults and people with disabilities. And I think that that is going to be such a huge barrier to overcome for us as a community. But I agree with you. I think there's been lots of advocacy. I think we've spent years talking about the growing population. We're about to be 25% of the state's population is going to be an older adult, and certainly many more people with disabilities. And so I don't know what statistic we can provide or what we can do to really cement the idea that, aging is something that happens throughout the lifetime. It's not just something that is, once you get old, you're old. Aging is something that you experience your whole life. You can get a disability at any point and need supports. And so I'll get off my microphone here, and I want to pass it to Dwayne and see, Dwayne, how is Cara thinking about the May revise and any perspectives you have?
Yeah, well, we appreciate the invitation and certainly uplift all of the strategic investments that Yasmin and Debbie and Sawait have brought forward, especially the acceleration of the restoration of the SSI SSP grant. That is among our top priorities. But I think our frustration, because I think we're more than disappointed. I think we're frustrated, and our frustration is rooted in sort of understanding the opportunity that we have right now, right? I mean, you just pointed out specifically, we are on the precipice of the largest demographic shift in this state's history, right? 1 in 4, I think the Master Plan for Aging projects close to even 30% of our population in 8 or 9 years are going to be older adults. And recognizing the opportunity now, especially given the volatility with the economy, the geopolitical situation, which also impacts our economy, the lack of specific investments in older adults and people with disabilities is staggering, given the abundance of resources that we have available this year. So, I mean, that's pretty much our perspective on this. Again, wanted to really uplift a couple of things. We did note one thing that Cara is really focused on is also housing, because we know that older adults are among the fastest growing population of the unhoused. And so we recognize the administration for making specific and I'll just say targeted investments around homelessness and mental health. And while we appreciate that, we believe there is still so much more that needs to be done across the board. But again, wanted to uplift that one point, and then also looking at the care economy, right? And the sheer, not only the workforce shortages that we are experiencing now, but how are we positioning ourselves with the resources available to us now to best prepare for the workforce needs of the future? And again, we would like to see more investments in those areas as well. But again, happy to be here and be a part of this great conversation.
Thank you so much, Dwayne. I think those are important points, and I should give Debbie the space to plug in transportation, because it's like housing and transportation go hand in hand. And I think Debbie, when I think of you, I think fondly about those transportation needs across the state. And homelessness, of course, workforce issues, homelessness. I mean, there's really a long list of things that we need to work on. And so I think there is some disappointment in the May revise not seeing those investments kind of coming through. And I want to just highlight Mark Burns, who's the executive director of Homebridge, always likes to drop this right into the chat and make it a part of the conversation. I think it's an important point. I think it was 2020, Mark, but the San Francisco Long-Term Care Coordinating Council held a session with a multitude of legislators. This was 2020, right when kind of fall of 2020, we had the pandemic. We were learning about the disproportionate impact on older adults and people with disabilities. We had just gone through this budget battle with total elimination of programs that Debbie mentioned, and Assemblymember Phil Ting said advocacy for older adults and people with disabilities is not even in the top 10 in Sacramento. That was the message we got. And again, this year at the Senior Rally Day, hearing Liz Fuller say, you know, if there's a limit, there's 12 bills, aging and disability is going to be like 12, 13, but certainly not 1, 2, 3. So kind of want to tie that together. And I just want to see if any of our panelists have anything else they would like to add.
Yeah, I thank you for bringing up transportation. We have over $40 billion in federal revenue coming in, and there was zero plan to address aging and disability from Caltrans perspective. It's been a very interesting experience to try and bring them along. I think Kim McCoy-Wade and Susan DeMorris have really invited them to discussions and part of the process, but their thinking in their knowledge base around equity is so ageist and ableist, not on purpose, just by virtue of part of the system, right? So we have an uphill battle without even talking about the money piece of it, but you know, even when there is money, it's not directed here. And Yasmin, in her comments, talked about how it could be argued that this funding could go to people with disabilities and older adults. Could be argued that. So when we talk about money funding homelessness, when we talk about money funding various things, but we don't say specifically for disability and aging populations, it is not going to go to them. Spoiler alert, it's not. If you don't designate, it does not go there. When I went to Fiona Ma, our state treasurer, and said, how much of the tax, because she's in charge of the tax credit allocation scoring that happens, right? So when they allocate tax credits to build affordable housing or low-income housing. And I asked how much of those tax credit allocations go to senior housing versus family housing or other types of housing. They're not tracking it. So if we're not designating it, we're not spending it there. I mean, I think that is a point that we all need to walk away with. We cannot just allow them to say, this could address. No, it must address. It has to designate. And I'm really super wanting to hear about what we can do.
That's great. Yeah, Debbie and I certainly want to turn to that as well. But I wanted to just ask, I mean, I think that the general sense is that it's not that aging and disability is completely left out of the May revise. It's certainly from the perspective of stakeholders, not as robust as we would have hoped, given our just insurmountable surplus here. But I'd like to ask all of our panelists, and actually the audience at large as well, how would you rate the May revise on a scale of 1 to 10? I'm going to launch like a little poll here. In a place where like 1 is poor, 5 is excellent. So 1, maybe like there's absolutely no investments for aging and disability. 5 is it's really rooted in aging and disability. And where's that middle? So I'd love to hear maybe Yasmin, if you could start us off, and we'll just do, round robin.
Do you want me to vote in the poll or just say what I would?
Oh,
vote?
you could just say it. Yeah.
I mean, I would rate it a 1 being poor. I mean, there's even the investments that are there they're minimal. I mean, I was going through the budget documents again to prepare for this. I was just really, really struck by just how minimal they are. And you compare them to the requests that stakeholders had. It's it's ridiculous that even these small asks that people were asking for didn't get funded. It's not like we don't know what, it's not as if stakeholders didn't have asks. It's not as if these issues hadn't been brought to light through the whole process of the master plan for aging. It's not as if the solutions to our problems, we don't know what the solutions are. We know there are solutions available to us. It's about allocating the resources and devoting the energy to solving them. And this budget doesn't do that. And so I would confidently rate it at a 1 for aging and disability.
Thanks, Yasmin. And Dwayne, what about you? What's your perspective as far as a rating goes?
The rating is tough. Yasmin, I mean, Yasmin really, struck a chord. I think for me, for Cara, I think we give it a 2. And I'm just going on the framework that the master plan for aging puts forward. There are technically investments in some of those programs, but I think, again, for us, in recognizing the moment and recognizing all of the advances we can make this year, given the instability and volatility of everything, we needed more now, right? And especially considering not only from the aging perspective, how many seniors are either on the fringes of poverty or are experiencing poverty. The acceleration of the SSI/SSP grant should have been a no-brainer from our perspective. So for us, we give it a 2. So much more work could have been done through the May revise. But I mean, could a 1+, a 1.5, like would that work? I think that might be where we fall on.
Sure, yeah, I don't see why it couldn't work. Debbie?
I'm going to go on the 0.5 since Dwayne allowed us to do a sliding scale. It's crap. I'm sorry. I mean, what was invested in aging and disability programs in this budget would be what I would expect in a recession. Not in a case where we have this many billions of discretionary funding. Not when we have just seen the last 2 years disproportionately murdering our elders and people with multiple chronic conditions. I mean, particularly coming out of this, particularly coming out of a place in a space where we have seen what happens in those skilled nursing facilities. Like, this is unforgivable, inexcusable, and it doesn't get a 1. I'm sorry.
Okay, a 0.5 from Debbie. So wait, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I echo all those sentiments. I think what's particularly frustrating, I'll say, is that, we have been in a pandemic for a couple of years now, feels longer. And, that really revealed deep inequities, in the delivery of care. And I think I know I used the word shocked, and Debbie, I don't think that was the word you used. I don't remember what word it was, but it's really disappointing, right? And coupled with the fact that we have $49 billion in discretionary funding, that that we see that the aging and disabled population were neglected, yes, yet again, right? And as Debbie said earlier, a budget is really reflective of your values as a state, right? And so given that, I think we would fare it, I'd say around 2. There were some investments that we were pleased about, but very disappointed nonetheless.
Yeah, and I just want to kind of just share what the ratings were. I hope people got to see that kind of result pop up on their screen, but I think we had about 47% that rated it either fair, 47 at poor, and just 7% rated it as good. There were absolutely no votes for very good or excellent. So maybe we have some optimists in our midst with that good rating. Well, I do want to kind of pivot the conversation too, because I think it's important to have a space to talk about missed opportunities. It's important to have a space to vent. But I tend to want to end on like a more positive note. So I guess my last question for our panelists is really about next steps. Where do we go from here? What should the stakeholder community be doing now? And I mean, concrete steps. Do we all need to get off this webinar and tweet? Do we all need to go get our support letters in? What is it that we need to do? And as Yasmin pointed out, there's still opportunity beyond the governor's budget with the Senate and the Assembly in the midst of negotiations. So maybe we can start with Sawait. What are your thoughts on what advocates can do to advance age and disability friendly investments, and not just this year, but what is it that we can do to be more effective in our advocacy in the years to come? Because it feels like we've really come together. We've been meeting with legislators, we've been advocating, we've been engaging with the state. What more can we do? Do you have any suggestions or recommendations?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, the, what's that saying? Like the squeaky wheel gets someone help me out.
Anybody?
Squeaky wheel. I think that we need to
It's the oil or something like that. You're going to get the WD-40. Yeah, they're going to need to hush you up, right? So we got it. We got it.
I think that we need to be rallying together, right? We need to be united in communicating our disappointment to the governor and the legislature, right? We have until, we have a few more weeks, right? And there are opportunities in the budget right now, though, some of which I sort of stated earlier. So I think that we need to be sending in our letters, right? Our coalition letters, right? We need to be calling our representatives, right? We need to be saying like, this is really disappointing. And if not now, when, right? And so that's what I believe that we need to be doing, Mariah, just very practically speaking.
Yeah, and I before I turn to the rest of the panelists, I know Nina's got to jump off and she's been patiently waiting with her hand up. So I want to open it up to Nina. Go ahead, Nina.
So Debbie, calling me out. No,
always, only because you're in the room though, Nina. I never would have said anything if you weren't here.
So anyway, no, I heard you. I've been reflecting on all of this. First of all, I think I said fair just because I've seen so many bad budgets. And yes, we have this ridiculous surplus, and yes, we're being ignored again. But I guess I think about literally standing in front of the Capitol with a previous governor and a bunch of us rallying for a proposition he supported, only to have him go around, turn inside, and blue pencil out the long-term care ombudsman program. So it's not great. It's not the absolute worst I've ever seen. So getting to what I was trying to say, I want to just think through a couple of things. As a group, we're really getting to the point now. I know that they haven't made any decisions, and I don't even think there's any more hearings. So what could be done in the next couple of weeks to really amplify our voices, I'm not sure. But perhaps two things, thinking ahead to next year, when we do have our lobby day, it is more thematic. Obviously, you need to have asks, but maybe we need to be out there every year saying our populations are being ignored. There are now as many people over 60 as under 19. Why are we still acting like this is the baby boom and we don't have enough schools? And I'm not a messaging guru, but that's what frustrates me, is the persistent ageism. It's incredible. I also want to point out another thing, a challenge we have too is that the folks coming up the pipeline into the governor's office really don't have an eye towards older, to seniors and persons with disabilities, despite what was going on in San Francisco when he was mayor. And one of the benefits of the network of age-friendly communities, it isn't just about getting folks to sign up, it's cultivating future leaders. Mm-hmm. And having those relationships, so as they move up, you have a way in. I'm going to now know you. And that is a slower process, certainly. But we're about to have a big turnover. I think there are folks, I know just on my ballot alone, it's almost all like city council members running against each other. So that's going to be, getting connected through the local networks, whether it's the local playbook or the network, is a way to really get to know those players, because their next step will be to come to Sacramento. And ultimately, one of them may end up being governor. But we're not, the big champions just aren't running for those positions. It can be a real exercise in frustration. I will just say, looking at the ballot in my district, where we have 2 open seats, do you know what the first thing I look for is? Do they say anything about seniors? Because we don't have enough voices. Is this person going to care about some of the issues we're working on? And basically, if they did, and they've got other metrics for Nina, I check the box. But we've really got to start figuring out a way to even be talking to candidates during the campaign, cultivating champions before they ever even get in Sacramento, and the network may be one way to do that.
That's a really great point, Nina. And I want to point out something that Wendy Peterson shared in the chat, just to build on Sawait's comments, which is really we should be getting on and talking to, the local folks should be talking to district directors, folks in district, getting on the phone to rally support for investments, age and disability friendly investments in the budget this year. But I love that idea of really kind of leveraging our local network, working together to build those relationships at the local level. I think that's great. And then another comment from Wendy, which is that their county lobbyist said that June is a bare bones budget will be passed, and the legislature and governor will be working out the details of the investments in the budget bill process. And if that's true, we still have time to influence the outcome. So without further ado, Debbie, do you have any strategies or ideas that are coming to mind?
Well, Maria, if I were a messaging person, like Nina said, that's not her sweet spot. It's not mine either. But I think this is where our opportunity lies. So Wendy talks about meeting with our legislators. We absolutely have to meet with our legislators. But I think that this battle happens so there's the inside game, right? So we're meeting with our legislators, we're cultivating champions, as Nina talked about. All those things are really important. And I want to come back to the cultivating champions, because that's an important piece. But for right now, in this moment in time, this needs to go public. This needs to go viral. This needs to, and we need somebody who can help us with that messaging, because is it going to resonate more with the average Californian that our arguments around ableism and ageism going to move the needle? Or is it that we are passing down a crisis of homelessness, of lack of healthcare, of all these things to our children and our grandchildren? Like, where is the argument most salient that's going to fall to people? Like that message, whatever that message is, we all need to run with that, right? We all need to be tweeting it, because they all like to check their Twitter. They're not on Facebook. Somebody else is doing their Facebooks, but they're doing their Twitters. So we need to be tagging them with whatever that message is. Again, not my area of expertise, but we need to find something and create a hashtag, and we need to get at it and go. I mean, that has to happen. But if we're going to talk about what we can do moving forward, I think that talking about building and cultivating those champions before they get into office is absolutely key. If you saw, let's learn from this, right? So the foundations chipped in. I think it was West and the Scan Foundation, and forgive me if I'm missing a foundation here, that chipped in on that campaign that did that statewide polling to find out voters were going to vote for a candidate for governor who invested in a master plan for not invest. They didn't use that word, and they should have. But if they were going to call for a master plan for aging, right? So they were feeding that into the campaign, which was brilliant. But we have that, and it didn't do us any good in this particular budget cycle. So what do we do in our cultivation and creation of champions that creates action around that and funding around that when they get into place? So I think there's something to be learned about. It worked, but maybe we need to be posing the question differently. Maybe we need to be elevating, as you were talking about, Maria, the statistics. What damn statistic do you need to see to make you take action? And so maybe we're not tugging on people's heartstrings because they are ableist and ageist. So what's a different way we approach it? I'm thinking about all of those things right now.
Yeah, absolutely, Debbie. I think that the theme of reframing aging and messaging, I wish Erin was here with us today because she would so appreciate this conversation. And for those who are not familiar with Erin, she has been our communications consultant for a couple of years for the collaborative and has helped us to try to develop this messaging. And she always underscores, it's like, you need the data, you need the data, but you need the stories too. So I think kind of, as we do our advocacy, can we integrate consumer voices? Can we elevate stories of success where community living has really impacted lives? Can we create some sort of podcast series that we are shooting and firing off on Twitter to pull at those heartstrings? How do we bring people into the fold? And I think for me too, Debbie, kind of thinking about, and I've been, I don't know, I guess I've been on the spiel for a little bit, but thinking about aging is not just, you get older, you get a disability, but this can happen at any time, that this is a process. And it's not pitting, the young versus the old, but recognizing that there's a continuum happening here. And it does matter. I mean, people my age are thinking about what are they going to do with their parents when they get older, and where do you go for that help and support? Maybe there's a campaign that really focuses on kind of just bringing people into the fold of what do they do when they need help with their elderly parents. All right, so maybe we can go to Dwayne and then Yasmin.
Yeah, and really great feedback from everybody. But I think, again, recognizing the opportunity of this moment, and I don't mean just in terms of the massive amount of resources that are available to the state right now, but politically, right? And recognizing that between this election cycle and next year, we could see, I think over a quarter of the legislature can possibly turn over. And Nina was right. And I think I want to highlight one point too, is that I don't know, I don't have any way to prove this, but from what I've been noticing and in working with candidates locally and statewide who are running for office, they tend to skew more younger. And I would like to include myself in that demographic. They are starting to look and resemble folks of my generation, right? And I do think that that many of the issues that we're all championing and that we've talked about today, it's not lost on them. We just have to help them reconnect with our issues. So in recognizing that we need to not so much build a bench, but identify champions and ensure that we hold them accountable and help them ascend to the legislature and really champion our issues is one thing. Number two, right now, just speaking, practically, it's not too late to do what you can to reach out to the budget subcommittee chairs, the budget chairs, send your letters in, do your best to meet with staff. I know, Cara, we had our lobby day last Friday, which was fantastic. We met with, I think, over 90 offices, and it was a great opportunity for us to elevate our budget asks, which is mostly reflected in this conversation that we're having now. And number three, I think is, in a world that is so polarizing, right, where there's no more bipartisanship and everything is crazy. I think we need to identify spaces like this where we can come together and collaborate and identify areas in which we can move forward together and support each other in our respective organizations or our individual advocacy around these issues as well. I think it's so important that we continue to find spaces to collaborate and work together. But there is a huge opportunity right now, just speaking politically as well, and I think we need to take advantage of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are such great points. And Yasmin, do you have anything to add?
Sorry, I was having trouble getting myself
That's
muted.
okay.
I would echo what everyone has been saying. I think there is in terms, I definitely echo what saying in terms of the future planning and getting ready. And I know there have been really good suggestions in the chat. But I will say that for this budget year, there is still time. So the decisions, I think advocacy should be directed towards the legislature, specifically towards the chairs of the Senate and Assembly budget, and then Speaker Rendon in the Assembly and Pro Tem Atkins in the Senate, because the decisions being made at this point are all, it's leadership. It's not your local assembly member, it's not their staffer. These decisions are being made at very high levels. And so to the extent that, you know, sending letters or tweeting or but the advocacy also has to be targeted, right? You have to come with specific asks. So that's why the MPA SAC sent a letter to, you know, legislative leadership and identified one key goal from each of the 5 goals in the master plan, one key investment from each goal, to try, because there was a lot of things we want, but we have to narrow it down. We have to give some concrete investments, or else we're going to end up not getting anything again. So I know that everyone has their favorite and top priority, but in this short amount of time, we've got to be coordinated in what we're asking for in this moment. So I will say that there is still time, but you've got to get your ask to the right place to be listened to. So that would be my advice. There is still time, but there is there's some strategy about going forward into next year and how to, and you know, like Debbie said, the work has been done. It's not like there's been, I don't want to diminish all of the work that's gotten to this point, but I think it's clear that there's more building to do, and movement building is never over. You never, you know, there's always progress to be made. So, and I think there've been a lot of good suggestions in the chat.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that we're coming towards the end of our time, so I encourage folks to check out chat, because there's lots of goodies in there, and questions as well. So feel free to engage that way. But I'm really kind of hearing 2 things. I think right now we focus on the legislature and we reach out to budget chairs and we tweet and tag them and kind of do that focused advocacy. But as we look ahead, it is about building champions. It is about engaging at the local level and cultivating what could be the next generation of legislators who might be more open to these issues. So yeah, I mean, lots of work to do. And I want to thank all of our panelists from the bottom of my heart for joining us for this conversation today. I know that the collaborative will be making a final push with the legislature this week and next to elevate some key items for budget consideration. And our members are working hard across the board as well. So we look forward to seeing how the final budget pans out in July, and we'll sort of reconvene another debrief on July 28th to follow up on this conversation and see where we land. Debbie kind of beat me to the punch, and while I typically don't like to end on a sad note, before we adjourn, I'd just like us to take a moment of silence and recognize the senseless loss of life this week in Texas. It feels like once again, our nation is grappling with a rising tide of gun violence and the tragedy of lives cut too short. And it's not just Texas, but in California, Florida, New York, Illinois, the list goes on. So we'll be keeping the families and the community of Uvalde in our thoughts and prayers, and hoping for national healing. So thank you, everybody. We'll share the recording, we'll share the slides, and we look forward to reconnecting with you soon.